Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
One season does not make a Hall of Fame career. But this pitcher, I think, has or had a case to be inducted into baseball's Hall of Fame. After all, he went 27-8 with a 1.93 ERA in 1923. He won 194 games over a 20-year career, more than some of his fellow pitchers who have been enshrined in Cooperstown. And his contributions as a coach in the majors and a manager in places like Cuba are immeasurable. Yet, when you mention his name, few can tell you anything about him. Next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to explore the outstanding career of a man who put together one of baseball's greatest seasons, Dolf Luque.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of Sports Forgotten Heroes, and our first episode of the new baseball season. We have several terrific topics on the way for you this baseball season, and we're excited to be working on all of them. Today, the story of Dolf Luque. Now, some of you might recall that we have talked a little bit about Dolf previously. You see, Dolf turned around the career of Sal the Barber Maglie, and when we did an edition of Sports Forgotten Heroes about the Barber, we discussed how Luque helped turn Maglie's career around. And we did it with baseball historian, writer, and researcher Peter Gordon. And once again, Peter is here. Only this time, instead of talking about Maglie, he's here to talk about the forgotten career of Dolf Luque. Of course, before we get to today's show, just a little housekeeping. You can learn more about our guests and the forgotten stars we talk about by visiting our website, sportsfh.com. There we have links to more information like stats, bios, and clips for guys like Dolf Luque, links to the books that our guests have written, a calendar for upcoming shows, easy access archive to all of our past episodes, and links so you can send us questions, comments, or even suggest forgotten heroes of your own whom you'd like us to do a show on. Don't forget you can follow Sports Forgotten Heroes every day on Twitter, @SportsFHeroes, or look for our page on Facebook. And please, keep those 5-star ratings coming. And don't forget to tell your friends and family about Sports Forgotten Heroes. They just might like what you're listening to as well. There is really never a perfect explanation as to why the careers of some are remembered and others aren't, no matter how good or marginal their careers were. Sometimes a player from a sport we love had one shining moment that goes down in infamy, and they're remembered forever. Other stars just don't get their due recognition for a myriad of reasons, and one such star might be our subject today, Dolf Luque. Now, playing for the Cincinnati Reds in the 20s and 30s, and the fact that he came to the U.S. without much fanfare from Cuba doesn't help. But when you consider the long history of the Reds and the pitchers who have suited up for them like Jim Maloney, Joe Nuxhall, Mario Soto, Don Gullett, Jack Billingham, and Johnny Vandermeer? That none of them won more games for the Reds than Luque did? Or that Luque is the 5th winningest pitcher in Reds history? That's sort of strange, don't you think? Luque won 154 games for Cincy. Only guys like Bucky Walters, Paul Derringer, and Epa Rixey won more. Maybe, as a sidebar, it's even more mind-boggling that no one to wear a Reds uniform ever won as many as 180 games playing for them. Nonetheless, Luque had a wonderful career. He actually played on the Miracle Boston Braves team of 1914, spent 12 years with the Reds, 4 with the New York Giants, and 2 with the Brooklyn Dodgers. His 194 career wins are more than several Hall of Fame pitchers, and for the longest period of time, he had more wins than any other pitcher from a Latin American country. Yet, Luque is one of those guys whose career is, well, forgotten. No one ever talks about the guy. Heck, even in a history book about the Reds, Luque isn't even mentioned. This, despite the fact that in 1923, he put together one of the greatest seasons ever for a pitcher, going 27-8 with a 1.93 ERA, 28 complete games, and 6 shutouts. At the age of 42, he went 8-2 and finished with MVP votes. That was for the Brooklyn Dodgers. As a coach and manager, as we mentioned earlier, he turned around the careers of many and helped make stars out of marginal players. So, why is Dolf Luque one of those guys who has been forgotten? Well, joining us now on Sports Forgotten Heroes to try and answer that question and to talk more about the terrific career of Dolf Luque is baseball historian, writer, and researcher Peter Gordon. Peter, welcome back to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you decided to join us once again.
Well, I'm glad to be back. I always love talking about baseball players.
Awesome. So, Peter, you and I had a wonderful discussion on Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 35, about Sal the Barber Maglie. And one name that came up a few times was Dolf Luque. Now, Dolf is, without question, at least in my mind, a forgotten hero. He really is. I mean, after all, if you were to go out and talk to, 100 baseball fans, I highly doubt 90% of them, maybe even more, would say they know who he is, despite the fact that Dolf won 194 games during his 20-year career. That included one of the greatest seasons ever, really, by a pitcher when he won 27 games for the Cincinnati Reds in 1923. So, Peter, who was Dolf Luque, and why does he deserve more recognition than he has received?
Well, Dolf Luque was the first Latino-born, he was actually Cuban, ball player to make a significant mark in the major leagues. Now, that might be not an unusual thing for fans today to realize because there are so many Latino ball players from the Dominican Republic, from Cuba even today, and of course, all of the Latin American countries. But when Dolf was playing Major League Baseball from the late teens through the 1930s, he was really the only one. I mean, there were some that had a small parts, but he was a star. I mean, you could say that he paved the way for all of the Latino ball players that followed him.
Interesting. So he comes to us, or comes to the majors from Cuba, like you said. Can you talk about baseball in Cuba back when Dolf was first learning the game? I mean, what was the game like back in the early 1900s? And do you have any information on Dolph's learning the game in Cuba?
I have a little bit of information. Let's just start with the Cuban Winter League, which essentially has been playing baseball in Cuba, or had been, starting in the 1870s. The folks in Cuba learned it from Americans, and really right around the time that the National League was first getting launched in the United States, Cuba had professional baseball. And it worked out really well, because the Winter League would start after the baseball season. So it started in November, sometimes December, and it would go until February, when the ball players had to go to spring training. And it was a very high level of baseball. The other thing to remember is that Cuban baseball was always integrated. Or I should say, because of the nature of Cuban society, there was never a thought that there'd be separate leagues for black players and white players. So the Cuban League always had some of the best ball players playing it in the winter that we would think of today as Negro League players, guys like Rube Foster, but also ball players that are in the Hall of Fame now for their Negro League service, such as Cristobal Torriente, Martin Dihigo, Oscar Charleston, Biz Mackey, Satchel Paige. All of those guys and more played in the Cuban Winter Leagues, and they played against Major League Baseball players, either in exhibitions or guys would be sent down to work on their game in the winter.
Interesting. Now, you had mentioned the Negro Leagues and the Cuban Leagues. And, of course, here in the States, we had the Major Leagues. And the shame of it all is the fact that the skin pigmentation of many Cubans was dark, and Major League Baseball wouldn't allow them to play. So how did Dolf Luque manage to cross the color barrier at that time?
Well, he was the right color. He was lighter skinned. I think Ricky Ricardo, Desi Arnaz. I know I use the character, right? I think of Ricky and Lucy, but Desi Arnaz, for example, is a Cuban who didn't face that sort of discrimination because of his color, since he was passed as light skinned, and Dolf Luque was a light skinned Cuban, light enough for the major leagues. He was on the right side of the color line, I guess, although he was referred to as swarthy. And also, it would not be surprising if there were Cuban ball players who did play in the majors that were even darker than him. It is a terrible stain on American history and on baseball that baseball teams were segregated for as long as they were, but that was the way it was. Dolf Luque was able to play. And since he was a solid major leaguer for years, certainly the guys he played against who were banned from the major leagues on account of their color could certainly have played. They had the talent to play.
You know what's really interesting is that Jackie Robinson obviously is considered the first man to break the color barrier, and he's so celebrated. I mean, the guy was just a phenomenal athlete, a phenomenal baseball talent, and surely that I don't think he would be in the Hall of Fame strictly because he broke the color barrier. But that is part of the reason why he is in the Hall of Fame, for all that he did breaking that color line. Dolf Luque was the first, as you said, Latino, or the first Cuban to play in the major leagues. And my gosh, 194 wins. So again, I ask, why do you think he does not get that same kind of recognition as a guy like Jackie Robinson?
Well, two reasons. One is that Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in the major leagues. There was no barrier to Dolf Luque because he was Latino. He didn't break the color barrier. He was the right color. He was just from Cuba. There were other Cuban players who have played in America. In fact, one of the first played in the late 1860s, early 1870s. Esteban Bilan played for the Troy Haymakers back really before the professional leagues were organized, and later managed in Cuba. So there was no barrier to break. And the other reason is, while Luque played for some really amazing teams, his greatest seasons were for the Cincinnati Reds in the 1920s, when the Reds were a good team, but they weren't winning pennants. And yeah, his great year in 1923 was maybe the greatest pitching performance between World War I and World War II. It's certainly one of the top 2 or 3. It's considered by people who are Cincinnati Reds fans to be perhaps the greatest single-season performance of any Reds pitcher. Mm-hmm. But it was a third or fourth place team.
If they speak about it, and we'll get to that later. I mean, there's been a lot written about the Reds, and for some reason, that 27-8 season that he had in 1923 is not referred to as often as you might think it is. Why did Dolf leave Cuba for the States? Was it strictly for baseball? If so, how was he discovered?
Well, it was exactly for baseball, because it's funny, for a guy who spent so much time in baseball, there's not a lot known about his young years. I think he may have deliberately not told people. Mm-hmm. He grew up in a working class neighborhood in Havana. Everybody knows that. But he didn't really begin to surface in the baseball story till he was in the Cuban artillery, where he learned how to play baseball and got pretty good at it. And there was, and he started playing professionally in Cuba in the early teens. Mm-hmm. And there was a Cuban doctor who lived in Long Branch, New Jersey, Jersey Shore, not actually that far from where Bruce Springsteen grew up. Long Branch, just, for those of you who want to know where it is geographically. And he recruited Cuban baseball players. So he brought Dolf to play for the Long Branch Cubans, to pitch for them. I want to say 1912, but it was certainly around then. And the team had 2 things going for it. One is it was a pro team in New Jersey, so it wasn't that far from several major league cities. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is they could play on Sunday at a time when Major League Baseball didn't play on Sunday.
Right.
So,
right. So what happened? They didn't play in New York. I thought perhaps they didn't play in New York on Sunday,
or in Philadelphia.
Okay.
Yeah, because there were blue laws back then. There were some places you could play on Sunday.
Right.
But George Stallings, the legendary George Stallings, who became manager of the 1914 Braves.
Right, I have this all written out here. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, he became manager of the Miracle Braves. I did a biography of Josh DeVore, one of the players on that team, so I know something about it. On a Sunday, he happened to see Luque pitch, so he recruited him for the Braves. And Dolf maybe.
Yeah, he had a terrific season for Long Branch. He was like 22-5, and yes, it was in what they called the New Jersey New York State League, which I guess is something similar to single A ball. And I guess Dolf really impressed a bunch of people. Most notably, though, he impressed Stallings. And Stallings was the manager of the Boston Braves. And it wasn't long before Luque was pitching for the Braves. In fact, I think he pitched for the Braves during their miracle year of 1914, even just briefly.
Yeah, he pitched one game, he lost it. Well, actually he pitched 2 games, but he lost one game and had a high ERA, and pretty much, Stallings had his staff and they were fighting for the pennant, and Luque basically rode the bench and then went back to Long Branch, which is interesting because had he pitched just a little bit better, or had Stallings given him more of a chance, he might have been a big contributor to that team, which would have made his legend even bigger.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I find it really interesting that Stallings was so impressed by Luque, brings him up to the Braves, who, what a year. I mean, 1914, they were last. They were left for dead, and they come all the way back somehow and win the World Series. But that's a story for another time, Peter. But what I find interesting is he gave up on him so quickly.
I know. Nobody's perfect, right? Stallings did a lot of things right that year, but not pitching Luque more was probably not one of them. By the same token, he could see that there was something there and picked him up, and maybe that experience with the Braves helped him when he finally did get his real chance a couple of years later with Cincinnati.
Sure. Speaking of what Stallings saw in Luque, tell us what he saw in Luque. What kind of pitcher was Dolf Luque? Tell us about his game.
He was a power pitcher. He's only 5'7", but actually back then 5'7" wasn't that small in baseball. I mean, now we got 6'6" pitchers, but that was back when Christy Mathewson was 6 feet tall, was considered a really big guy.
Mm-hmm.
So Dolf Luque was 5'7", stocky. He had two pitches. He had a fastball and a curve. He was not afraid, eager, in fact, to throw inside the batters when he needed to.
Mm-hmm.
And he would throw, and so he was a master at using the inside fastball to set up the outside curve. I actually have a quote, not from me, but from a guy who saw him pitch.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Al Lopez, the great manager, also a Latino, he was a catcher. He's in the Hall of Fame as a manager with the White Sox and the Indians.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that Luque pitched overhand, and the curveball broke straight down as a drop pitch. And so he was sometimes he was a righty, but he was more effective against lefties than righties because of the way his ball moved.
Interesting. And one other thing about Dolph is, and this could have affected his recognition as well, and that's he had a very fiery temper. And on one occasion, he had enough of the razzing that the New York Giants were giving him while he was pitching for the Reds. He placed his glove on the ground, turned, and charged the Giants' dugout to take on one of their players, and a guy by the name of Casey Stengel got caught in the middle, and Dolph purportedly leveled Casey. Can you talk about Dolph's temper and that incident?
Yeah, you hear a lot of different things from people, because certainly the stereotype in a time when America stereotyped everybody was Latinos were fiery. And on the one hand, you're talking about a guy who pitched 20 years in the major leagues, then later had an exemplary career as a coach and a manager. He must have been able to control himself at some point, but he was well known to fly off the handle. And in that particular case, it was the summer in Cincinnati. The story goes that there was some construction in the ballpark in what they called Reds Park then, so that in those days, it wasn't nearly as regimented as today. So they just put the benches out in foul territory while they were working on the dugout, which meant that it was a lot easier to hear what people said.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a right fielder for the Giants named Bill Cunningham, who was really getting on Luque. And of course, they would always insult him as a Latino player. And that day he could hear him really well, and he just had enough, and that's exactly what he did. Again, showing temper over sense, he charged the bench. But he wasn't actually aiming at Stengel, the story goes, and I believe that too. He was aiming to hit Cunningham, but Cunningham ducked, and he hit Stengel in the chin and knocked him over.
But
then the benches cleared and there was a big brawl, and cops had to escort Luque out of the stadium.
Is that incident, or does that incident still have a stain on Luque? I mean, how devastating was it? And is it something that he can overcome, even in death? I mean, a guy like Juan Marichal overcame his incident with Johnny Roseboro. Is it something that can ever be overlooked, or is Luque's recognition forever stained, and he'll never be spoken of as a great pitcher, or as great a pitcher as he was? He'll never be given the kind of recognition he possibly deserves.
I don't think that incident is a problem for his reputation and legacy. If anything, it gives him a little more color, so to speak. At least Dolf Luque, fiery temper. So you have a handle. He's not anonymous. And like you said, Marichal overcame that incident with Roseboro, and that was a lot worse. Luque put down his glove and went at him with his fists. He didn't attack anybody with a bat like Marichal did.
Exactly.
I think if there's a reason why Luque is not as well known today or not as revered, it's because of the way he split his achievements between U.S. Major League Baseball and all the Latino professional leagues. Mm-hmm. If you add up all of his wins that we can count between Major League Baseball and Cuban baseball, you have a total up in the 280s. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty impressive. That's, Satchel Paige territory.
Sure.
If you add up all of Satchel's wins.
But still, Peter, it's really interesting that even in Cincinnati Reds lore, he is not remembered or spoken about in the way that some of his brethren, some of his fellow ball players who played at the same time as he did are spoken about. In fact, I read about this book by John Baskin called The Cincinnati Game, which is a pictorial history of the Cincinnati Reds. And Baskin never even mentions Luque, this despite the fact that in 1923, he led the National League with a 27-8 record, a 1.93 ERA, and 6 shutouts. I mean, it's one of the greatest seasons ever by a Reds pitcher, and in a book that is devoted to the history of the team, Luque isn't even mentioned. That's a head-scratcher.
Yeah, I don't get that. If I was writing about the Reds, I would want to write about Luque in those years. By the way, a couple of other interesting facts about that year. He led the league in shutouts with 6, and his ERA that year, the 1.93 ERA, was the lowest ERA by a Latin pitcher until Louis Tiant in 1968, which was the year of the pitcher. That year is even, Luque's year, 1923, is even better in the context of what was going on, because that was the first years of the lively ball, and batting averages were up and home runs were up, and it was a much tougher environment to pitch in.
And one of the other amazing stats about that 1923 season I found was this. Dolf Luque actually hit a home run in 1923, but as a pitcher, he threw 322 innings and gave up just 2 long balls the whole year. I mean, wow. Again, wow. 2 home runs. What did he do in 1923 to dominate the opposition like he did?
Well, I wish I could bottle it and give it to some of the pitchers we have pitching today.
Yeah, no kidding.
Who can't complete games. He was very good at learning, very good at setting up hitters, getting them to what we like to call hit pitch, which is hit the ball he wanted to hit. Another interesting thing is that Luque said that he learned his curveball and learned how to set up hitters from Christy Mathewson, the great giant pitcher, and it's believable, not just because they were sort of contemporaries, but Mathewson, after he left the Giants, came over and was the manager of the Cincinnati Reds in the teens, but before he went to serve in World War I. So it's quite possible that Mathewson could have seen something in Luque and showed him how to save his arm. Mathewson wrote a famous book about pitching called Pitching in a Pinch. I want to get that right. And his whole pitching philosophy was get him to hit your ball, save your fastball, your best pitchers for when you really need a strikeout. And given the amount of innings Luque pitched over his career between the U.S. and Cuba and Mexico and every place else he pitched, I think he learned how to do that.
Now, before you said he was a power pitcher who had a great curveball, but unless I'm missing something, I went back through his stats and I didn't see a lot of strikeouts. So was he more of a control pitcher? I mean, what did he do on the mound? When you think about a power pitcher, you usually associate that with a guy who can strike out a lot of batters. But again, he didn't. So explain what you mean by he was a power pitcher, or why the strikeouts didn't come along with his power.
Well, batters didn't strike out nearly as much back then as they do today. I mean, Babe Ruth struck out a lot, but most batters, they still believed in making contact. So in the 20s and teens, you may not see as high of a strikeout ratio as you would in other years. He did have a very good, he didn't give up a lot of hits though either. You know, that's why I said he got the batters to hit it where he wanted them to hit it. And another thing is Luque said about himself, and by the way, not easy to find a lot of Dolf Luque quotes in my research. But,
I imagine not.
He did say, some pitchers with the count 3-2 will cut loose through the center of the plate. I never do. So he would never give up. He had great control. And as a result, when you combine that with mostly throwing fastballs where you can throw it, I consider that a power pitcher, at least for those days. Oh, another thing about his 1923 season, he was 32 years old.
Yeah, sure.
He got a late start in the majors because he got a late start playing baseball, and then he started out in Cuba. He didn't really start pitching for Cincinnati until 1918 when he was already 27.
Yeah, I mean, and he pitched for several years after that. I mean, didn't he play for the Giants and a couple of other teams too? Yeah,
he pitched till he was 40. He pitched till he was 44. And he was still effective.
Right. So let's talk about that for a second, because again, you go back to 1923, he goes 27-8, which, by the way, was the only time he won 20 games in a season. But later on, even though he was still effective as a starter, he sort of became like a part-time starter. Why was he not given the opportunity to continue to start, despite the fact that he was really effective?
Well, there's two reasons. One is the way the game was played back then, but I'll start with the second reason. He had a temper, and managers might have been leery about putting him into certain crucial situations. But the other thing is, back in the late 20s and early 30s, ball clubs played a lot of doubleheaders. They were traveling by train from city to city, so that took longer. There weren't as many games on Monday and Tuesday, so pretty much every Sunday was a doubleheader. And teams needed what became known as a Sunday pitcher, a guy that could start on Sundays without messing up the rest of the staff's rotation, and that could also be spotted in. And as he got older, he had the smarts, he still had an arm, he still could pitch. That kind of became his role, especially in the 30s with the New York Giants. I mean, in 1930, when he was 39, he went 14-8 for Brooklyn, which was also quite a feat because that wasn't as bad as some Brooklyn Dodger teams were in 1930, but it was still pretty bad. And he still had an ability to pitch.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back a little bit.
Sure.
Since we're talking about all these different teams. His first team was the Boston Braves, as we talked about earlier, and he just didn't make it with the team. He pitched in 2 games, I think, over 2 seasons. And I'm guessing after that, he went back to Long Branch, where in that first year, by the way, he was 22-5 for Long Branch. How did he wind up with Cincinnati?
Well, he was upset about it, again, based on reports from other people, not as much reports from him. But he was upset about that because he was cooling his heels in Long Branch, but he was pitching well in Cuba. And he also played in Mexico. Basically, Luque would go wherever he could get paid. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, he was doing this in places where other people were scouting him. He wasn't the only person who was pitching in these leagues. Major league players would go down there to pick up extra money in the winter, and they would also play in Mexico. It was the same thing. They were professionals. They played where they could get paid. So what happened was, not only was he a good pitcher down there, but he hit really well. And then he pitched for Louisville in the American, I think that was in the American Association at the time, in 1917. And Louisville is it's in Kentucky. It's not far from Cincinnati. The Reds scouted him, and they signed him. Mm-hmm. They signed him out of Louisville. He pitched really well. I think in 1918 he went 11-2 or something with a 2 ERA for Louisville. Mm-hmm. And the Reds picked him up and brought him to their club in 1918.
And that's the team that he enjoyed his most success with. I mean, we already touched on that magical 1923 season. Overall with Cincinnati, he pitched 12 years and went 154 and 152. So he was only 2 games over 500. But you sort of can't fault players all the time for all the pitchers all the time for all the losses. I mean, one year he was 16-18, and I think he even got some MVP votes that year. But he did help the Reds to a World Series title in 1919. And he appeared in 2 games and didn't give up a run. And, of course, 1919 was the famous Black Sox series. He was the first Latin American ball player, if my research is right, to appear in a World Series. Talk about his time in Cincinnati and how important a player, how important a pitcher was he for the Cincinnati Reds? What did he mean to that team?
Well, even when he was a spot starter and reliever, every team wants somebody that you know is going to come in and know how to get guys out. So he was a very, very valuable part of that team. In 1919, spot starting and relieving, he had a 10-3 record. He had an ERA of 2.63. He wasn't the main pitcher on that team. In 1919, yes, he was the first Latino pitcher to pitch in the World Series. He didn't give up a run, but what he did was he finished up 2 Cincinnati losses. But they couldn't have won without him. He became, by the early 20s, certainly by 23-24, a mainstay of the staff. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one other thing about that 1919 Reds team, mm-hmm. I know, especially if you watch the movie 8 Men Out,
sure,
everybody keeps talking about how great the White Sox were, and if they hadn't thrown the World Series, they would have won.
Right.
That Cincinnati team was one of the best National League teams of the teams mm-hmm. in terms of wins. It had Hall of Famers on it. It had Roosh on it. Mm-hmm. It had great pitchers, and the Reds maintained every single one of them to their dying day that they would have beat the White Sox even if the White Sox were trying. And some people think the only game that was actually thrown was the first game.
Interesting.
So it was a great team. And he was the best pitcher on the team. It's just, unfortunately, the team didn't win any pennants mm-hmm. after 1918.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A lot of my research I did through SABR and a bio written by a gentleman by the name of Peter Bjarkman. I hope I got that right. He wrote a Dolf Luque bio for the SABR bio project. And folks, if you want to find out information that you never thought you could find out, go to sabr.org, SABR.org. If you are a fan of baseball, it is a wealth of knowledge on that site, and they are trying to write a bio, literally, of every single person who has ever appeared in a baseball game, and Peter Bjarkman wrote one about Dolf Luque, and in that bio, he talks about John Thorne and Pete Palmer, who created what's called a pitcher's index. And that rates a pitcher's effective performance against the entire league. Going back to 1923, that season is ranked fourth best during the period when Luque played, basically from 1920 to 1940. Now, one season does not make a Hall of Fame career, but, and this is a big case here, Peter, when you consider what he did in 1923, plus the fact that he won 194 games over 20 years, and a guy like Dazzy Vance, whom I don't hold anything against, he also won 194 games, but he did it over 16 years. Both of them had career ERAs of 3.24. So why is Dazzy in the Hall of Fame and Dolf isn't? And again, I'm not saying Dolf should be in the Hall, and I'm not taking anything away from Dazzy Vance, but Dolf was pretty darned consistent over a long period of time, as well as that 27-win season. It does present an interesting case, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And not to brag a lot about SABR, but of course I'm a longtime SABR member. If we had, or if the people back then had the same sort of tools, I think they would have appreciated Dolf more. For example, his 1925 season for Cincinnati, you mentioned it before, he went 16-18, and back then they cared more about wins and losses. But his ERA, he led the league in ERA. He led the league in shutouts. He got some MVP votes. And today, if you're Jacob deGrom, that kind of season gets you a big contract extension.
Yeah, I mean, how much did the losses affect Luque's credibility? I mean, we are past that today. When you look back at a guy like Jacob deGrom, who went 10-9 last year for the Mets and won the Cy Young Award and turned that into a $137 million contract, many of the voters did not penalize him last year over the fact that the Mets just couldn't score runs for him. And I'm a Mets fan. I'm thrilled for Jacob deGrom. But when you look back, it's not a comparison. I mean, we should be comparing apples to apples, but we're not. So how much do the losses affect the notoriety, the credibility of Dolf Luque and I guess other pitchers of that time?
Well, they certainly do, because part of the issue, if there is an issue about Dolf not being in the Hall of Fame, is at the time he was considered to be a solid pitcher, but I don't think they saw his greatness as much. And if the other thing about the Hall of Fame is that you should be getting credit, and many players do get credit, for service to baseball. And in that sense, Dolph's pioneer status should count. And you're also talking about somebody that's in 4 baseball Hall of Fames already. He's in the Cuban Hall of Fame. He's in the Cincinnati Reds Hall of Fame. He's in the Mexico Baseball Hall of Fame as a manager, and in the Latino Baseball Hall of Fame. So, yeah, I think if you want to say he's one of those very important baseball figures, there might be a place for him. But he was a pretty darn good pitcher anyway.
And And he was a heck of a manager in Cuba. I mean, he managed, I believe it was just over 22 seasons of winter ball, and he's like the second all-time leading manager as far as wins are concerned in Cuban baseball history. He's got several championships under his belt. Talk about his ability as a manager and how he was able to put a team together and win on such a consistent basis.
Well, I think as good a pitcher as he was, and as positive an impact on his teams he was as a pitcher, I think it's as a manager and as a developer of players where he's one of the greatest of all time. The thing about the Cuban leagues was you could keep some of the players, but basically every year you were looking at a new team, and the managers back in those days had a lot more control over who was playing for them than they do today. You know, we think of the general managers in major U.S. baseball as being the folks that get the talent, but when Dolf was managing, he got the talent, and of course he had contacts in Major League Baseball. He knew everybody. He managed and played pretty much year-round, and he was always able to get the players that he needed. And, of course, players would go to him because they wanted to learn, particularly pitchers. They wanted to learn what he had to teach them.
Mm-hmm. And one of those, of course, was a guy who we did you and I talked about way back when, Sal Maglie. And that work that he did with Sal cannot be overlooked. Talk about how he helped transform the game of Sal Maglie.
Well, Sal was actually a pretty nice guy, from what everybody said, off the baseball field. And when he first was discovered as a pitcher, he was apparently a pretty nice guy on the baseball field. But when he went to the Mexican leagues in 46 and 47, Dolf was his manager. And Dolf, of course, had played for the Giants. And it was Dolf who basically showed him how to pitch inside, and that it was important to pitch inside if you wanted to be successful. One of my all-time favorite baseball players, Tom Seaver, I remember seeing him quoted as, "Show me a pitcher that won't pitch inside, and I'll show you a loser." and Sal learned how to pitch inside. That's how Sal became the Barber. Sal the Barber. He would shave the chins of the batters opposing him with a fastball and then nail him with a curveball. In that sense, he was very much in the Dolf Luque mode. That's what Dolf would do.
Were there other pitchers when Dolf was playing in the majors that pitched the same style, close shave?
Well, it was a little bit more common at that time. Like Dazzy Vance had an amazing fastball, just to name one. Mm-hmm. And over in the American League, Lefty Grove was very well. I mean, he was more in the late 20s, early 30s, but Lefty Grove was also well known for his fastball and his inclination to throw it in close. And of course, Grove is in the Hall of Fame and won 300 games. Mm-hmm. So there were other pitchers who did that. But I was thinking, where I thought you were going was other pitchers that Dolf Luque helped develop after Sal, because Camilo Pascual.
Well, I was going to go there as well.
Oh, okay. If you were going there, I'll wait on that.
Yeah. So, but go for it. We're there already. Who are some of the other pitchers that give Dolf credit, or Dolf gets credit for helping develop?
Well, you had Camilo Pascual, who pitched for the Senators. He was a great Latin pitcher. He developed some Negro players who could only could play in the Negro leagues too. Martin Diego was actually, he played several positions, but he also pitched. And I want to say there's a couple of interesting stories about how the way he handled some of his players in the Cuban League.
Well, talk about that. Give us a little history. I mean, we're here talking about Dolf Luque. Let's paint a picture of some of the things that Dolf did.
Well, Dolf was a legend in Cuba. because he pitched in the major leagues, for many years, the Reds were the favorite team of many Cubans. And it started a line of players, not just because of Dolf, but for many years, the Reds could go to Cuba and find players. Then he got a nickname in Cuba. He was called Papa Montero, which I can't pronounce well because I don't pronounce Spanish all that well. But it was based on Papa Montero was a famous salsa dancer known for his tricky dancing and on the edge lifestyle. And Dolf was a gambler. Gambling was legal in Cuba at the time. He, like many other players of his day, drank heavily, but many players did. He certainly pitched for a long time, even drinking and doing the other things. He never really settled down ever in his life, although he did get married in 1946.
Mm-hmm.
But he lived a lifestyle where he made a lot of money and he spent a lot of money, and was a hero to every Cuban player who wanted to play in the major leagues. In addition to pitchers, another Cuban player he developed was Bobby Avila, who was the first Latino batting champion for the 1954 Indians.
Mm-hmm.
I would want to double check that, but he certainly was a very successful player in that year that the Indians won 111 games.
Mm-hmm.
And he played with everybody. That's the other thing about Dolf Luque. Because he played in Cuba and so many players came down there, he played against Babe Ruth. He played with Cristobal Torriente. Tommy Lasorda was on Dolph's team in the 40s. Although, here's the story. You know, Tommy Lasorda is famous for hugging everybody, right?
Sure.
Okay. Tommy Lasorda said, Luque was the worst human being I have ever known. He told a story where there was one of the pitchers on Luque's team was Terrence McDuffie, who was a pitcher. Terrence was famous for being a really good pitcher. It was, again, someone in the Negro Leagues who never was allowed to play in the other major leagues. Mm-hmm. But Terrence was also known as being very, very good looking. And he liked to party. So one day, Terrence was trying to beg off of pitching because he didn't feel like it. He had a hangover. And according to Lasorda, Luque went into his office, came out with a revolver, pointed it at McDuffie, and all of a sudden McDuffie's headache was better, and he went out and pitched. And Lasorda has said, Lord Lasorda said in the story I read about that was, I was there, I saw that. It wasn't like I heard about it from someone else.
One can only imagine if McDuff didn't get up and go pitch, what would have happened.
Yeah, I don't know that he actually ever shot anybody. Certainly that never came by. But that's one of those things where having a reputation as somebody with a fiery temper can sometimes be motivating.
Hey, you said that he really never settled down, although he did get married in 1946. What was life like off the field for Dolf Luque? Or was he baseball 365 days a year? What was he like away from the field?
It's interesting because the research I've done on that doesn't have a lot of off-the-field information.
Yeah, I couldn't find much.
He had a daughter, not by somebody that he married, but his daughter back in the 1930s was actually a Olympic level swimmer for Cuba, swam in the Pan American Games.
Mm-hmm.
He did get married to a woman he met when he was managing in the Mexican League, a woman named Yvonne Resek, and I hope I pronounce that properly. That was in Puebla, where he was managing, and actually she survived him. She was able to go to his inauguration in 1985 in the I want to say the Mexican Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
But other than being known for his temper and being known for being a hard drinker, a partier, a gambler, and someone who spent the money, he was not what you would call a family man.
Mm-hmm.
Or if he was, that evidence has not survived.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about the other? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I wonder if that had something to do with the fact that he was a Latino, his first language was Spanish, and might have not been an easy interview for the sports reporters of the day.
Mm-hmm. What about the other players in the majors, in the Cuban leagues, in the Mexican leagues? Did they get along with him? I mean, here's a guy who you said pointed a gun at someone, lost his cool, and went after Bill Cunningham and accidentally took out Casey Stengel. He threw high and tight. Did he get along with the other players? Did his teammates get along with him? Were the teammates at the time the only guys to get along with him, and then when he went to a different team, they didn't like him? I mean, what kind of guy was he with the other players?
I'm sure that if you were on Dolph's team and you played hard, he was as nice to you as he could be. And that if you weren't working hard or you were on another team, you didn't like him very much. Because he was that kind of a competitor. That's why that quote I gave you earlier was a key to him. He never gave up. Never said, "Oh, it's 3-2. I'll just throw it down the middle." He kept playing. You don't pitch that many years. You don't keep winning that many pennants unless you had a very competitive, fiery heart, which I think he did. Mm-hmm. And really, yeah, I mean, Tommy Lasorda obviously didn't like him. But Sal Maglie did. Sal Maglie loved him.
Sure.
And so did a lot of the other players who played for him. The stories of his temper, at least as a manager, were for the guys who were trying to beg off competing.
Interesting. Peter, in the end, well, before we get there, what else should we know about Dolf Luque that I was not able to uncover? What else can you share with us about Dolf Luque?
One thing I do want to mention is he did win the final game of the 1933 World Series for the Giants. Won it in relief, but that was the Giants World Series victory against the Senators.
It was Game 5, and he came in relief, I believe, and he was, I believe, the first Latin American player, perhaps, to win a World Series game. Is that correct?
Yes, as far as I could discover, he was. And that, again, was just a great year. He was 42, by the way. We're moving up into Bartolo Colon territory at this point. Although I guess Bartolo pitched longer. But, yeah, he had an amazing year. 8-2, 269 for an ERA. And he actually, again, got some MVP votes that year on a team that had Bill Terry as the manager and first baseman, Hall of Famer Bill Terry, Hall of Famer Mel Ott.
Wow.
And Dolf Luque's contribution was enough to get to get some of the sports writers to notice him. Oh, yeah, and the number one pitcher on that team was a guy named Carl Hubble. So
not a bad team.
No, and he pitched and played a long time. And the other thing we should remember about Dolf Luque is he was still managing at the time of his death. He had a heart attack at the age of, I want to say, like 66 or something like that in 1957, and he had managed the year before. So he was working up until he died.
In the end, why should we remember Dolf Luque? What made Dolf Luque such a special player in the history of baseball? And again, I have to ask, why is he not spoken about more often than he is?
Well, first of all, he was a pioneer. He was a great competitor who pitched at a time when it was tough for pitchers, and he was one of the best. He contributed in a very important way to some of the most historic teams. He developed as a manager and a coach lots of great players who followed him, and he really was the trailblazer for Latino ball players in the United States, and I think more of them should know about him. He wasn't Jackie Robinson, but he was important. If it wasn't for Dolf Luque, maybe you don't have Minnie Minoso. Maybe you don't have Pedro Martinez.
Interesting.
So that's important. With the statistical tools we have now, his career in the majors looks a lot better than it was. And when you add in the fact that this man was able to pitch year-round and be a winner, and manage year-round and coach year-round and be a winner, I think you have one of the most remarkable careers. And I think if he had had a more prominent role for teams in New York City, we might know about him more. If he'd won 27 games for the 1923 pennant-winning New York Giants instead of the number 4 Cincinnati Reds, I think we would know him a lot better.
Interesting. Very interesting. Peter, I want to thank you once again for appearing on Sports Forgotten Heroes. I love talking with you. And again, I'd hope you'd consider coming back.
Well, I'll be happy to come back and talk anytime you want. Oh, and if I could just say one more thing on the SABR front. If our listeners are interested in learning more about Cuban baseball, Peter Bjarkman edited an anthology called Cuban Baseball Legends. It's actually called Baseball's Alternative Universe, Cuban Baseball Legends, which is published by SABR. They can go to that website if they're interested. And I also have a biography in it. I wrote a biography of Cookie Rojas for that.
Oh, cool.
But there are biographies of many, many of baseball's greatest Cuban players. So that would be another place they can go to look.
Awesome. Well, Peter, once again, thank you so much. I'll definitely make mention of that on our website, sportsfh.com. Again, thanks for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes, and look forward to speaking with you again.
Same here. I had a great time. I always love talking baseball with you.
Over the course of his long career, Luque won 154 games for the Reds while losing 152. For the New York Giants, he was 19-12. For the Brooklyn Dodgers, he went 21-14 over 2 seasons, and the Braves, the team in which he came up with for the proverbial cup of coffee, he was 0-1. His career ERA was 3.24. He tossed 26 shutouts and 206 complete games. His contributions to the game in Cuba and Mexico were honored with inductions into their respective Halls of Fame. And he is a member of the Reds Hall of Fame, despite the fact that so few Reds know anything about him. No doubt, the career of Dolf Luque was splendid. Was it worthy of being enshrined in the baseball's Hall of Fame in Cooperstown? Well, that's for a lot of others to decide, and on the surface, a 194-179 career record doesn't sound all that impressive, especially considering he won 20 games just once. But he was incredibly consistent over his 20 years, and he did win more games than several other Hall of Famers. But wins alone are not the only measurement for a Hall of Fame induction. It's about the entire body of work, and Dolph's entire body of work was simply marvelous. I'd like to thank Peter Gordon for joining us. As he mentioned, check out SABR.org for more information on the game, and you might even want to join SABR. That's SABR.org. I'm a member, and it's a really great resource for all fans of the game. Next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to talk about one of baseball's relocated teams, a team that in 2019 is celebrating its 50th anniversary despite the fact that it only existed for one season, the Seattle Pilots. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.